I asked you guys the other day over on the community tab what type of video you would like to see from me next here on this channel, and not surprisingly, a lot of you said that you wanted to see me make another card, but a lot of you also said that you wanted to see another Cricut tutorial, so I thought that today we would do both. Now, before you click out, no, you do not need a Cricut to make this card. I just chose to incorporate the Cricut because there were a couple of elements that I did not have dies for, but don't worry, I will walk you through the entire process from beginning to end. And today we're going to be making a card that is a little bit more sad and somber, which I know is not our favorite card to make, but it is sometimes unfortunately necessary, and we are going to be using one of my very favorite background stamps. And if you stick around until the end, I'm actually going to show you a second card that you can make using the same stamp, same technique, but gives you a very different card in the end. And by the way, if you're new here, hi, my name is Ralph. I make card making and crafting content all around the internet. I'm so glad you're here. Now let's jump into the card. All right, before diving into the card make, let's just talk very briefly about the primary supplies that we're going to be using for today's card. Of course, you can use whatever supplies you have on hand, but if you'd like to recreate the exact card that I'm making today, I would say these are kind of your three must-have products. Starting with this 6x6 red rubber background stamp from Hero Arts. This is called the Rain Texture Bold Prints, and I am obsessed with this stamp. I keep coming back to it over and over again, and I honestly think it's one of their more underappreciated recent releases. And in combination with this background stamp, we're also going to be using this white unicorn pigment ink by Hero Arts as well to create our raindrops. And then lastly, the third primary element we're going to be using is this artwork grid plate by Simon Says Stamp. It's just a basic 3x4 cover plate die, and you can use it for a lot of different things, but today we're actually going to be using this to create a window frame. And as always, everything that I use today will be linked down in the description below, so if you see me using something and you're curious what it is and I fail to mention it, I promise it'll be down below. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our background, which is going to be a nice rainy background. And for that, we're going to do some ink blending. So I'm pulling out my Waffle Flower Grip Mat, and then I'm going to be using some Distress Oxide inks today. And I chose three different blue tones to work with. We are using today Chipped Sapphire, Salty Ocean, and Tumbled Glass. And I'm basically going to go in and ink blend all three of these down the panel, starting at the top with Chipped Sapphire, Salty Ocean, Tumbled Glass, working dark to light. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? I normally speed up this portion of the video where I'm ink blending, but I had someone mention in the last video that they wish that I would have left the full ink blending in. The problem is I will be here sometimes for like 5 minutes getting my ink blend just right. So I'm probably still going to speed this up. But just know that it takes a little bit longer than it looks. If you're new to card making, those of you who have been card making for a while, you know this. But basically what I do when I ink blend, especially a simple tri-blend like this, is I'm going to go in and apply ink in kind of thirds. So I'll do a third Chipped Sapphire, a third Salty Ocean, and then a third Tumbled Glass. And I won't really worry about blending those together. Now keep in mind, this is just my technique. I don't know if this is the correct way to do it. But once those are all three down, then I will go back and kind of blend each layer into each other. And honestly, it just requires a lot of patience. It's not going to look perfect, especially if you're new to it. But the more you do it, I promise you will get better at it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and speed this up from here. Okay, and with that, I think we have a completely blended ink background. Of course, it's not perfect, but the great thing about this design that we're making today is we're actually going to be covering this background with not only the rain stamp, but also some clouds. So in actuality, this ink blended background is truly going to fade to the background, and no one's going to notice any tiny little imperfections that you and I might notice. So let's go ahead and take this off the grip mat. And then the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and apply our rain stamp. And for the stamping of the rain background, of course, I'm going to bring out my Misty stamp platform. Now, you don't have to use a stamp platform, but I think you'll find it to be quite a bit easier. And I'll tell you why. If you look at the stamp, you can see that it's designed with the raindrops coming straight down, and they're perpendicular with what you can imagine would kind of be the ground down here, right? But I would like my raindrops to be coming in at an angle, just to really emphasize the strength of the rain and the storm that's going on. So let me go ahead and pull this out. and take it off the backer. So what we're going to do is we're going to angle the stamp, but we want to position it in such a way that it still covers the full panel of the card, and we're still able to pick it up with our stamp positioner. So it's a little bit of a, you got to kind of rig it just right. But that looks good. We're covering the full panel, and I'm still going to be able to pick that up with my MISTI, no problem. Now, what you might want to do, just to be careful here, is to add just a little tiny bit of tape runner on the back, just enough to keep your card panel in place so that if you have to restamp, you're not in desperate trouble. Now, let me make sure that my stamp is still going to cover the full panel. Of course, now it's not. Okay, I believe that's close enough. We should be just fine with that. And then I'm going to ink up my stamp using this Unicorn Pigment ink by Hero Arts. This is a white pigment ink. I hardly ever stamp with pigment inks ever, really, unless it's black. But I think that white only comes in pigment inks. Someone correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but I've pretty much only ever seen white inks come in a pigment ink. But that does mean that these raindrops are going to dry a little bit slower. So whenever we apply this, you need to be a little bit careful because the rain might be a little wet and it could smudge if you're not careful. Okay, and how freaking beautiful is that? I don't even think it needs a restamp. It looks pretty perfect to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this off to the side and let it dry for a little bit. Once it's dry, I will then rub off this adhesive that we put on the back, and then we will be off to the races. Okay, so I'm going to clean this stamp off a little bit, but while I'm doing that, I want to tell you a little bit about the next step. So what I want to do is add several clouds to our stamped rain background. The problem is I already know that I don't have cloud dies, or at least I think I have a couple, but they're not really what I'm looking for, which is not a problem because I have my Cricut joist. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut out some clouds to use for the background, and I promise it's super simple, super easy. So let's go ahead and jump over to the computer view and I will walk you through that very quickly. Okay, clouds. Let's go ahead and dive in, shall we? I went ahead and added a video of myself down here in the bottom just to let you know we're in this together. I got you. I know some of you are a little bit new to Cricut and maybe even a little bit intimidated, but I promise adding these clouds is going to be so super simple and easy. So to get started, you can see I have a blank, clean, fresh new canvas here, and I'm going to go ahead and click over on Images over here on the left-hand side. And I'm going to filter our images by the operation type cut because I just want plain die cut clouds. And then I'm going to go to our search bar and type in clouds. And from there, I'm going to get a list of cloud images that are all just simple cutout clouds. And I'm going to go through and pick a few. To do that, you'll just simply click and then click Add to Canvas. So I'm going to scroll through here and click maybe 3 or 4, add them to my canvas, and then I will meet you there. Okay, so we've added our clouds to the canvas, and you might notice that they are extremely large, which is obviously not going to fit on our card. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just select all 4 of the clouds, which you can do by clicking and dragging that little rectangle over all 4 of the images. And then I'm just going to resize them down very quickly. We might do some additional resizing and tweaking here in a second, but for now, I just want to get them small enough to where it's easy enough to work with. And then let's go ahead and zoom in a little bit more. And the next thing I'm going to do is a little bit of a hack that I use. Well, it's not really a hack, but it's a trick that I like to use whenever I am using the Cricut for my cards. I'm going to go over here to Shapes and just click the square one. And you'll notice that it's going to default to 2 inches by 2 inches. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to enlarge on that so that it's 4 1/4 inches by, you guessed it, 5 1/2 inches. And I need to zoom out a little bit more. And as you know, that is the standard A2 size greeting card. So what I like to do is I actually like to use this as just kind of a template and basically a digitized card base. And I'm not actually going to cut this out at all. I'm literally just using this as a reference point so that I can decide on my scale and placement of my other images. Does that make sense? And I also want to make sure all these clouds are the same color. So I'm going to go ahead and select them all again and then go up here into the top left and choose a color. I guess we'll make them white because they're clouds. And the reason you want them to all be the same color is because if they're different colors here in design space, when you go to cut, Cricut is going to think that you want to use different color cardstock for each image, which you don't really want to do. In this case, we want all the clouds to be white. And if they're all different colors, then Cricut is going to set up the cut such that you need to be switching paper for every color, which we don't want to do. Okay, so these clouds look a little bit small for the scale I was going for, so I'm actually going to enlarge all of them a little bit, and then just kind of start placing them around how I might think that I want to use them on my card. I think that scale looks pretty good, honestly, so I'll probably just go ahead and go with that. So next up, we're going to cut our clouds, but before we do that, I don't want to cut out this back rectangle, remember? So you can either click that layer and click delete, or you can use this little eyeball icon, which will essentially just hide that layer, and when we go to cut, Cricut will just completely ignore that layer. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and hide it, and then it's time to cut. And today I'll be cutting on my regular old Cricut mat, actually my extra long mat, the one that's 12 inches long. Okay, and then this is just showing us a preview of how the cut images will be on the mat. Let's go ahead and click continue down here in the bottom right. And today I'll be using my heavyweight white cardstock, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the default heavy cardstock option here. And then it is time to load up our mat and get to cutting. So I will go ahead and jump back to the overhead view and we will get to it. Okay, so I've got my Cricut Joy here on my work surface, and then I also have my 12-inch mat here, which I've already applied some white cardstock to, and I'm going to go ahead and just load up the Cricut. All right, and then back over on the computer, I'm just going to click the big green go button, and then we will have clouds in a matter of seconds. Okay, and there you have it, folks. We have 4 beautiful clouds, and these are very white, obviously. So what I'm gonna do next is I wanna apply some gray or maybe even black ink to these just to make them look really stormy, because that's the vibe we're going for. Okay, I actually decided that I'm gonna use Black Soot Distress ink, which is technically a black, but I'm just gonna use a light hand, and it should be more of a dark gray, right? Okay, and just like magic, now we have 4 dark and stormy, moody looking clouds. And we have a couple of smudges here and there. I don't know if you can see my tiny little fingerprint I left there. But that's okay, because I think depending on how we place this on the background, that'll take care of itself. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up my work surface here. And then the next to last thing we have to do is actually create our window. Because what I'm trying to create is a card that looks as though you are inside of a building or a home, right? And you're looking through the window out into a dark and stormy sky. So we have our dark and rainy background, we have our stormy clouds. Next, we need to create our large window to peer through. And to do that, of course, we are bringing back out the artwork grid plate. And for the window, I want to do a black window just because those are, you know, trendy and modern, right? But instead of using plain old matte black cardstock, I'm actually going to use this black glossy cardstock from Simon Says Stamp just to give the window a little bit of extra interest. I really like this glossy cardstock. I don't use it that often, but I've used it to create like tile backgrounds before, and it's beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this down to size so that I don't use up too much of it, and then run this guy through the die cutting machine. Okay, and of course, then the most satisfying part of this is punching out all of the little black squares that we have here. And now we have a beautiful, kind of glossy, I don't know if it shows up well on camera, but a glossy window frame. And what I've actually done is I also went ahead and cut out a second window frame, but this one I just used regular old black cardstock because I didn't want to use up all of my fancy shiny cardstock. But the reason I cut out 2 is because I'm actually going to stack these just to give the window a little bit extra lift and dimension. It's just going to make the project look a little bit more interesting. But before we do that, and this is where things get really interesting and it begins to actually look like a window, I'm also going to cut out a sheet of acetate that is the same size, 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and I'm going to put a sheet of clear acetate between these 2 layers, and then it's really going to look like a window. And to adhere the acetate, I am just using regular old liquid glue. Now, you do want to be careful when using liquid glue with acetate because acetate is such a slick surface that it's very easy for the liquid glue to kind of smush and run. So what I would recommend is putting down a very thin strip wherever you're adhering to acetate and then just be very cognizant of your placement. You kind of want to get it right on the first try. As far as acetate goes, you can use whatever type of acetate you would like. I am using a very fancy acetate from Cricut, which has this protective film on both sides, but I will also link a cheaper alternative down below. But this one from Cricut is very nice because it keeps your acetate nice and clean. Okay, now let's carefully layer this guy on. Ooh, that's mostly straight on, I think. And then once this is dry, I'm just going to go ahead and apply some liquid glue on the back side of this grid, line it up with the other grid, and pin it down. So I'm going to let this dry and then glue this on, and then I will catch up with you here in a second.
5 minutes later.
Okay, and there you have it. We have a completed window. Doesn't that look like a real window pane now? So we have our window pane, we have our clouds, and our rain background has also dried by now. So you can kind of see the elements are all starting to come together. The very last thing we have to do before we actually put these all together is, of course, we need a sentiment for the card. So let's go ahead and bring the Misty back out. And then for the sentiment, I'm going to be using the stamp set from Simon Says Stamp called Here For You to kind of go with the overall melancholy vibes of the card. And I'm really gravitating towards this stamp, It's Okay to Not Be Okay. So I'm going to use that one. Let's grab the stamp, pull it out, and then of course we need some cardstock. And I don't want to use white cardstock because we already have all the white clouds. But what I think I want to do is actually tie back in to this sky and use a dark navy cardstock. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the cardstock in the color Nautical from Hero Arts. Nautical is a really gorgeous navy blue, and I think it's honestly one of my favorite color cardstocks to use. I don't use a ton of colored cardstock, but I really love this Nautical blue. Okay, so let's go ahead and position the stamp. And before we stamp, I want to go ahead and hit it with a little bit of anti-static powder. A lot of you card makers already know what this is, but I have gotten a lot of questions from people who don't know what anti-static powder is. This is basically something you want to apply to your cardstock before you stamp, if you're going to be doing heat embossing. And it's going to keep your embossing powder, which is what we're about to apply, from sticking anywhere but the stamped image. So you're not going to have a bunch of stray embossing powder showing up all over your paper, which just makes your project look a little less neat. Now let's apply our embossing ink. And I think I mention this every time I emboss, but whenever I'm applying embossing ink, I always like to give it at least 2 layers of ink, because once you apply the embossing powder, you really can't go back and add more ink. So you might as well make sure it's well inked up front. Okay, that looks good. Let's bring in the embossing tray, and then I'm just going to be embossing with white. I'm using the white detail embossing powder from Hero Arts. I'm just going to dump that all over. Sometimes I give 2 dumps just to make sure it takes as much powder as it can take. Okay, and you can kind of see here we do have a little bit of stray embossing powder, and then we also have this weird little hair going on up here. What I'm going to do is grab a tiny little paintbrush and just kind of try to brush those stray pieces away, and then I'm going to zap it with the heat gun. Okay, and there we go. We have our sentiment embossed, and then just to get off some of that anti-static powder that we applied earlier, I'm going to take just a barely damp cloth and just kind of give it a rub down. Some people say to use a dry cloth. I always go in with a damp cloth. I've never had a problem, but you know, proceed at your own risk. And then finally, we're going to cut it out using the coordinating die. Okay, and just like that, we finally have all of the elements we need to begin putting our card together. So what I'm going to do next is kind of a fun exercise in framing and composition. We're basically going to take our background here, and then we have these clouds, and we can just kind of play with where we want them to be positioned. Now, I know that they're going to be falling off the edges of the card, which is what we want. We want to give it a very natural, organic look. And you can kind of just play around with the placement, see what you like, and then even hover this frame over top and see if you like how things are looking, which I think I am. I actually feel like I might want to add a little bit more gray to some of these. Do we feel like that's dark enough? I think it's fine. I think it gives the overall vibe. And then what I'll probably do is then take the sentiment and just have it sitting down here in this bottom right-hand corner. So let's go ahead and glue down or tape down. I think what I'm going to do is actually use a little bit of tape runner. I'm going to go ahead and tape down all of these clouds. But you know what? Actually, I am going to add a little bit more gray shadow to some of these because I just kind of feel like it's needed. Okay, I actually added gray to all of them, but I think that that looks a little bit better and looks extra moody, so I'm glad I did. Now I'm going to go ahead and start gluing these down. And this card to me is such a prime example, in my opinion, of why I think it's so important to be able to think kind of outside the box and how you use your supplies. I know a lot of people are either traditional crafters or Cricut crafters, and there's not a ton of crossover or people that like to do both, but there are so many things you can use your Cricut for in your traditional card making. I will always be a traditional analog card maker, if you will, at heart. That is what got me into card making and crafting, and it gives me the most joy. But I love that I'm able to use my Cricut in cases like this where I didn't have any cloud dies, but I had an idea and a vision in mind. And because I had my Cricut and I knew how to use it, I'm able to take that vision and make it a reality. It doesn't mean that my Cricut is necessarily replacing, you know, the hobby and craft that I love. It's almost just enhancing it. But that's just my opinion. I love the flexibility it gives me. Okay, now let's go ahead and trim these little guys off. And then this is one of my favorite parts about whenever I use dies and place them off the page, is once you cut the edges off, you kind of get extra dies. So if you wanted to add more clouds, you now have all these tiny little cloud bits that you could use to add more clouds in theory. For instance, if I wanted to add a little cloud down here in this corner, I could go in and add that bit, or maybe you wanted to add something up here. You know, the options are endless. But let's look at what it looks like with the frame first, and then maybe we can decide if we want to add any extra clouds. So the sentiment will be sitting kind of down here. What if we had another one up at the top? Is that too much? I think I am going to add this tiny little guy to the top right-hand corner. I don't know why. I think that it just kind of helps extend the image upwards off the page. At least that's what I'm seeing when I look at it, and I kind of like that. So I'm going to place this guy up in the top. And then now we can go ahead and glue down our window frame. And for this, again, I'm just going to be using some liquid glue. Now, if you were really daring, I'm not this daring, you could turn this into a shaker card, right? I feel like these edges are a little thin, that I would have a hard time getting foam tape on these edges. But if you were able to turn this into a shaker card and put some type of like raindrop shaker behind the window, that would be really cute. If anyone does that, please, please tag me in your final creation. I would love to see it. Okay, now wish me luck. Let's line this up real perfect. Please. Okay, I think we did it. I'm just gonna press it down and give it a second to dry. Okay, now that that's dried, we can finally adhere our sentiment, which I'm going to use just a little bit of foam tape to pop this guy up on the front. And do you see what I mean whenever I said your blend doesn't necessarily have to be perfect? Because we've covered up so much of it with the frame and the rain and the clouds that honestly, when you look at it right now, the blending does look kind of perfect. Not to toot my own horn, but I say that just because don't worry too much about it. It's going to be all right. It's fine. Let's just take these backers off, put our sentiment down, and then the last thing we have to do is apply this guy to a card base. I think that's straight. Looks straight enough to me. I'll go with it. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and grab a card base. And this is just a standard old A2 size card base. So this would be an 8.5 by 11-inch sheet of cardstock cut in half, and then folding that half in half. And I'm going in with a little tape, and then for some extra stronghold, I am going to also add a drizzle of liquid glue. And then since I don't want to mess up now, I am going to bring my score pad out so that I can make sure I line the sky up just perfect using the right angle at the corner of my score pal. Ta-da! Okay, and there we have it. We have a fully completed card. Do you see that glare on the window? It makes this whole card look that much more realistic. And obviously it's not realistic, but it really drives home that idea and concept of looking through a window at the storm outside. So this will be a great encouragement card or get well soon card. And I've used this stamp and actually same ink blending pattern for the sky in another card. I'll go ahead and pop that on screen as well so you can kind of see another way that you can use this very same technique to get a completely different result. But aside from that, I think we are done here, y'all. That is the card project. As always, you can find everything I used here today linked down in the description below. If you liked this video or learned anything, I would love for you to give it a like and a comment. That really, really helps me out. And if you're new here, or you're not new here, but you're not subscribed yet, I would also love to welcome you to subscribe and join the channel and stick around for the next video. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you would also enjoy a video I did a couple weeks ago where I taught you how to create realistic looking ocean waves on paper. I will leave that linked down below as well if you want to check out some more card making content. But besides that, thank you all for being here. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye, y'all.